very good morning to everybody. Thank you for coming to attend this event. I'm really happy to have you here in our 8th ECD Day, our English Culture and Diversity Day, uh, whose theme is Culture and Diversity in a World of Misinformation. So my name is Ivan Ribeiro. I am the coordinator of the event this year, and we are here for the opening session for this event. And I would like to invite a few guests to talk to us in this opening session. I would like to start with our Fulbright ETAs, Frederick Lee, and Dylan Glunt. They are here with us, and they are the ones I am very thankful because they are part of the organizing committee. And I would like you to say hello.
Um, Hello, everyone. Glad to see you all here. My name is Frederick, and I'm one of the ETAs at the University, Federal University of Uberlândia this year. Like Ivan was saying, we've been working together to put this all, to get this up and running. And I'm really grateful for his support, as I'm also thankful for the other team that we have working with us behind the scenes, and just the Litras staff and professors overall. Really been having a great time, and I'm glad to have everyone here and hope we have a great event.
Yes, and I'm Dylan Glunt. I'm here with Fred at the university. We arrived here in April, and we've been absolutely enjoying our experience here, working in Brazil, working with all of the amazing people at the university. And yeah, we're going to have a great time today, I think.
Thank you very much, Fred and Dylan. Now I would like to call Professor Carla Tavares to say a few words and talk to us.
Good morning, everyone. So first of all, I'd like to thank Professor Ivan Ribeiro, the English literature team of our course, and our ETAs, Fred and Dylan, for having accepted the challenging of conceiving and conducting the 8th ECD Day, an event which is promoted by Curso de Letras, Inglês e Literaturas de Língua Inglesa at the Federal University of Uberlândia. So all the idea of ECD Day started with our ETAs, to whom we must be eternally thankful for bringing up this idea and for carrying on with us all these years. And this ECD Day, which means English Culture and Diversity Day, has been proposed as one or two events which aims at discussing issues related to cultural diversity in a globalized world. So far, ECD Day has addressed themes such as nation and independence, cultural diversity and identity, civil rights and world Englishes, and lots of other ones. I'm going to mention each one of them. So the first one, it was carried out as during the Thanksgiving time in the United States. So it was in the end of towards the end of October, I think, or November. And we promoted a Thanksgiving dinner at university for like almost 100 people. And the ETAs and our senior citizen students helped us to cook and promote everything. It was, I think, one of the biggest events that we had. And it was very nice to see how people cooperated and how people enjoyed spending the day
Is
talking.
it me or is it Carla who has an unstable connection?
I don't know.
Just let me know, guys.
Could you see? Could you hear me? Yes? Can I go on, Ivan? because for me, it looks like everything is fine. So please let me know if I have a connection problem. Yes? All right. So I'm going to start or to say it again. So our first ECD Day addressed the Thanksgiving Day and the theme of ECD Day, because we could never imagine that ECD Day would last that long. So English, Culture and Diversity Day, and we chose to address the topic by having this Thanksgiving dinner, which was prepared, as I said before. I hope you heard, by our ETAs and our senior citizen students. And then we had the global, independence, and we marked this, this role of words and the meanings by independence. So we set the in between parentheses, nation and identity, the global road for equality in an age of diversity, because it was also promoted during Independence Day in the United States. It was in July, in fact. Next, we had World Englishes. And the following year, we had a question as the topic of the event, which is, what does democracy mean? And it was, in fact, in 2018, during the last election, presidency election. And all this theme, the subject of fake news, misinformation and disinformation, I remembered were already addressed during the event, but as a secondary theme. The following year, we had the World of Tomorrow in 2019, Innovation that moves us forward, which was an event that counted with different areas, very transdisciplinary, organized by Marco Aurelio, which was at that time a substitute teacher in our course, and is a former student of our course, which gave us lots of pride. And last year, in the middle of the pandemics, we were courageous and brave enough to promote an event that discussed resistance and resilience narratives in the face of COVID-19. This year, our task is to arouse the debate around a crucial time at this time, which could be summarized, in my opinion, in the following question: what can be considered ethical in a world in which a massive amount of information circulates in numerous different ways? And I hope in the end of the event, we can, at least each one of us, formulate an answer to this question. Because misinformation and disinformation aren't new, but digital and social media are allowing misleading, false, and harmful content to spread at a rate that is endangering society. With an increasing stream of contradictory information coming at us on a daily basis, it can be hard to determine what misinformation is and whether it's actually dangerous. So propaganda, misinformation, and fake news have the potential to polarize public opinion, to promote violent extremism and hate speech, and ultimately to undermine democracies and reduce trust in the democratic processes. Consequently, taking action is crucial, and one step towards this is the promotion of debate forums like this one, in order to enlighten society, make it aware of the risks we are running, and motivate each one of us to take responsibility for generating change. For this reason, my wish for all of us is that the 8th ECD Day provides an opportunity to expand our discernment in times when common sense has never been so necessary. Thank you all.
Thank you, Carla. Great words and great perspective on the events we are Starting now. I'm sorry for the loss of connection because we check everything except the internet cable. So
No problem.
sometimes it messes us up.
That happens.
It does, it does. Um, Now I'd like to invite Professor Maíra Maiagava to say a quick to say a few words to us.
Thank you. Hello to you all. It's a great pleasure, for me to say a few words on behalf of the English Linguistics and Literature Teacher Education major we have here at UFO, Universidade Federal de Uberlândia. The theme for the 8th ECD Day, Culture and Diversity in a World of this Misinformation, could not be more appropriate to our recent times. This brings us the opportunity to engage in the topic and to think of different ways of approaching the information we know or we believe we do. The power of literature can enlighten us, and the guest speakers today will promote diverse and contemporary discussions. I would like to thank this event organizing committee, all the professors involved, and the ETAs we have here with us at UFO this year. I wish you all a great event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Maíra. Thank you all. So it's an auspicious moment that we have here on this um, the 7th with the 8th ECD Day. I would like to thank all the people involved in promoting this event for the 8th time. I want to thank Professor Gilmar for the tech support and the support staff who will be together with us all day long. I want to thank the coordinator of the Letras course at UFO, who shares the screen with me right now, for helping to make the event possible. I would like to thank the Fulbright ETAs, Frederick Lee and Dylan Glunt, for putting their minds and effort in the organization of 8th ECD Day. I want to thank our crew, our professors, and our students, the director of ILEL, Professor Ariel Novodvorsky, Professor Fernanda Ribas from our extension section, and all the people somehow involved in the event. I also want to thank Professor Scarla and Professor Cristiani for carrying out the ETA project at UFO, without whose support and pushing it wouldn't be possible to get to number 8, and still counting. My love, my recognition to them. And my sincere thanks to all the guest speakers who have accepted to participate in the event and share a bit of their knowledge with us. Professors Viviane Madeira, Caroline Hiro, Professor Nylen, Professors Fernando, André, and Erue, my dear friends, Professor Mark Tonelli, whom I had the great pleasure to meet recently, and Professor Cielo Festino, and my dear friend Claudia Negro. To each of them, my respect and my admiration. To introduce this event, I would like to point out that in 1976, the blues musician, songwriter, and poet Gil Scott-Heron, he died in 2011, wrote and performed the song Bicentennial Blues. In that song, Heron tried to depict American history by using facts and acidic criticism against consumerism, politics, politicians, and the corporations whose profits were and still are larger than the benefits that they promote. The so-called Bicentennial Song tended to be a satirical description of how America, willing to be big, was immersed in a sea of corruption and home of capitalist savages, a place for sexism, racism, and a fertile ground for many other isms. Just like Gil Scott-Heron and Americans in 1976, we find ourselves in our bicentennial year. Since 1822, Brazilians have struggled against a sea of inequalities based on the rumors that date even before that time, and what is meant by rumors could be defined by the distorted view that this country has been given towards the imperialist interests. With Pero Vaz de Caminha, we understood that this land was a well of riches, ready to be taken, and so it was. Our gold, our wood, our minerals were little by little drained off to the empire. Our natives were slaughtered because they believed in different gods and were, I quote, no good to be enslaved. With the big farmers and owners of the land, we tasted the bitterness of African slavery, officially lasting for more than 3 centuries, and right up to today, reparation has not been paid. Thus, I would like to call this quick talk a paraphrase of Gil Scott's song, and I will call it the Bicentennial Samba, a musical genre, survived by the whipped Brazilian Women Incorporated, who have donated their bodies for the construction of the Brazilian society. The samba has its origins in the basements of those countless ships coming from Africa, many times vessels, many times coffins. This samba land was given as a gift to unskilled men who, in an attempt to tell the native to work their own land for nothing, went to Africa and started the slave trade for more than 300 years, leaving a trace of blood, whipping, mutilations, and punishment. The samba survived, nevertheless. It was abolished, it was set free, and was sent to the city, where it suffered twice as much for invading the space of the elite. The samba struggled against the rumors that it was for the black, poor mass, struggled against classical music from the mansions and rich buildings. The samba was scorned and torn apart, had to climb up the hills and settle in the favelas. Occasionally, the samba went downtown, where it started to be accepted by the society. Not on a regular basis at the beginning, the samba became the taste of the city, but just for fun, not for true friendship of the rich. September the 22nd, 1822. May the 13th, 1888. 66 years and 21 days was the period that the samba toiled to be free and given an inexistent home. In the streets and in the terreiros, the lundus, the calundus, the batucadas found their home, exposing the dances and the chants so that the society could see, feel, and sing along. In its childhood, the samba did a great work making itself known, transforming itself, growing up. As a youngster, the samba raised to another level, becoming a genuine Brazilian genre. It was promiscuous enough to mingle with other musical styles and other cultures just because it was inevitable to keep far from the influence of samba. The samba, though, was and still is in the headlines as a criminal, a synonym of injustice, but it was in the fashion magazines too. Society learned how to love samba because of its power and its sense of omnipresence. The society learned to samba dance by force because it was necessary, a payback for all the ripping off, just like Gil Scott Heron announced, the samba was ripped off like donated moments from the past. 200 years ago this year, 200 years ago last year. And what about now? The samba is now. The samba has grown up, and the country has not. The country has been ripped off like the Indians, ripped off like nature, ripped off like freedom, ripped off like justice, ripped off like true media, ripped off like schools, ripped off like everything else that the Brazilian identity represents to the world, manhandled by media overkill. Despite being despised, the samba survived. The samba survived in Bahia, the samba survived in Pernambuco, the samba survived in Minas Gerais, the samba survived in the Rios, Rio Grande do Norte, Rio Grande do Sul, Rio de Janeiro, and in all the states where injustice prevails, the samba resonates. The samba has survived fake news and all the downsizing. The samba took the Brazilian flag to the street and the popular festivals. The samba stood up against the fury of generals, disguised in metaphors. The samba went to the streets in the most prominent political moments in our history. The samba is left winged so it can fly higher for freedom. The samba is now mature and is still transforming itself. Nowadays, the samba fights against fake news and false rumors, fascist and Nazi governments, and this is what we can expect from this genuine genre, for it mingles with our roots, our ethnicity, our culture. And for this event, we intend to discuss a few topics which allow us to understand a bit more about the concept of freedom and how to look at examples of redemption. Along this day, the invited guests will provide a range of talks that connects to the themes stated above, creating dialogues that will be extremely useful to get to know our society better. With wishes of a great event to all of you, and in hopes of peace, harmony, and goodwill to look at differences, let's start another ECD Day, the 8th English Culture and Diversity Day in this bicentennial year. Thank you very much. And with, with this talk, we um, now are going to the opening roundtable session of the event. And I would like to call um, to the screen Professors Viviane and Professor Caroline Hiro, who are the guests who will uh, deliver a talk to us in this lovely morning. I would like then to once again thank you very much for accepting our invitation, accepting to be here with us and share a little bit of your knowledge. And it's a very good, it's an honor to us to have you both opening the 8th ECD Day. So the first talk of the day is by Dr. Caroline Hiro from Nagaland University, whose title is A Manifestation of India's Diverse Culture in Literature, with special reference to Arundhati Roy. And just for us to get to know Dr. Caroline a little bit more, she completed her bachelor's and master's degree in English from Nagaland University, India, having conducted her master's in philosophy research on post-colonial consciousness in the select works of Arundhati Roy and Shimamanda Ngozi Adichie, a comparative study. In the year 2018, Dr. Hiro recently finished her PhD on thesis titled Contemporary African American Fiction, Exploring the Strands of Post-Colonial Concerns in the year 2022 at Nagaland University, India. Dr. Erue's academic and research experience to date have provided her with an excellent background in English literature. She has published several manuscripts in peer-reviewed journals and has also presented a few research papers in the reputed international conferences and seminars held in India. Her current research is focused in the area of post-colonial studies, African American literature, comparative literature, and fiction writing. In addition, Dr. Hiro has qualified national eligibility test exam 3 times during the years to 2017, 2019. She also holds the professional membership of Osmania University Center for International Programs in Hyderabad, India. So, Professor Caroline, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to introduce Professor Pedro Malard Monteiro, who also will help me carry out the debate at the end of the talks. Very good morning, Pedro. So, Professor Caroline, the floor is yours and the screen is yours. Welcome to our event.
Hi, warm greetings to each one of you from India. At the outset, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Ivan and Professor Christiane for providing me this platform through which I can share my thoughts on India's diverse culture and literature. I also extend my warm regards to everyone present in this 8th ECD Day. I will be sharing my slides. I hope my screen is visible. Is my screen
Yes,
visible?
perfect,
Okay,
Caroline.
thank you. This is a brief outline of my talk. We have seen that colonialism and imperialism have decisively shaped world literature, and this is substantiated from the plethora of reforms and changes in the 20th century worldwide, which affected and changed the social, political, cultural, and economic echelons of all nations. By 1914, we find that a large majority of the world's nations had been colonized by Europeans in different degrees of expression. Because colonialism is the practice where one country violently invades and takes control of another, often while forcing its own language and cultural values upon its people, there is profound loss of identity and indigenous culture. Imperialism, then, can be understood as the ideology or logic that drives colonial projects. While the colonies elevated some groups within societies to elite status to maintain control, such actions exacerbated existing ethnic rivalries and also initiated long lasting intra societal conflicts. Even after the official dissolution of its formal state in the age of decolonization, we thus find that the colonial hangover, as in the words of Di Maya, lingers on even today. While the initial period of European colonialism after 1400 was characterized by efforts to completely eradicate or suppress native cultures, the new imperial era of the late 19th century was usually marked by less brutal efforts to spread dominant colonial cultures. This era marked the formalization of the self perceived civilizing mission by colonial powers in areas of Africa and Asia and the prevalence of institutionalized racism. Colonialism was based first on a sense of difference, and this difference was often expressed in the language of racism. Institutional racism often led to interracial racism, which further led to intraracial racism. Although the experiences did not play out in the same way, the colonial subjects everywhere had enough in common that the shared set of experiences can be called colonialism. The development of new technologies during the 19th century further accelerated the drive for imperialism. Many native leaders sent their children to European schools, a custom that the British in India particularly encouraged. At colonial schools, native students were taught the culture and traditions of the imperial state, while their own culture was denigrated. History was told largely from the white man's perspectives, and as such, many of their stories were misrepresented. And here, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's statement about the danger of a single story rings true. The process of colonialism and imperialism led to the disintegration and spreading of cultures that further led to multiculturalism and globalization. The globalization era has been characterized by intensified cross cultural interactions as well as an explosion in migrations. For some scholars, globalization is simply imperialism with a different name. There is an influence of and to each other when divergent cultures come into contact that often results in new multicultures. Since the 1970s, multiculturalism has developed into a policy of most nations. Although the policy of multiculturalism aims at a peaceful coexistence of various cultures that interconnects with one another while also maintaining their individuality, in practice, the minority societies are marginalized in the reinforcement of the dominant cultural group as central. What we see happening in America with the police violence perpetrated upon the African Americans or the Hindu Muslim riot in India account the failure of multicultural nations in incorporating the principles of multiculturalism. If we look at India, the occupation of India by the British for centuries has had a huge impact on the Indians. The British rule, starting with Robert Clive's victory in the Battle of Plassey in 1757 and leading to colonial expansion and the establishment of the British Empire, presents one of the most unusual phenomena in Indian history. Imperialism played a key role in the interaction of world cultures, resulting in new forms of literature, art, and other forms of cultural expression. Amid the varying debates regarding colonialism's many legacies, Indians' interactions with colonialists also have led to some positive attributes in their culture. And one of the most positive impacts is seen in the Indian English literature. Indian writing in English is generally believed to have begun with the rise of the British rule in India. By the 20th century, we see that several Indian writers have made themselves known not only in their traditional languages but also in English, the language of the colonizer. Britishers ruled India for a very long time, and in the process, the Britishers acquired India's wealth and empire, and India, on the other hand, got Western education and English language. The main reason behind introducing English to the Indians by Thomas Macaulay or Lord Bending's idea in promoting European literature and science was to maintain a class of administrative officers and civil servants by the Britishers to govern this huge country. However, in the self-serving motive of the British, Indians benefited at large as the growth of English education indirectly led to the spread of Indian nationalism and revolutionary thought. Indians have the ability of storytelling since the time of Rig Veda and Upanishad, but undoubtedly, Western literary models have had a huge impact on Indian literature, and such forms as the novel writing began to be adopted by Indian writers. Contemporary Indian literature began to respond to the new era by addressing new subjects of the agonized existence of modern man and man's quest for self in all these complicated situations. With their feminine sensibility, women writers further opened up a new prospect in the world of fiction. With women writers such as Arundhati Roy, independent free thinking on the part of women became possible. Indian writing in English has successfully recaptured and represented the multicultural and multilingual society which has gained enormous interest worldwide. Arundhati Roy can befittingly be said to be the first Indian woman novelist who has powerfully set a new mark for Indian English fiction. Born in 1961 in Kerala, Roy is not only a prolific writer but also a political activist involved in various human rights and environmental causes. In some ways, Roy's narration can be called a significant turn towards the historical trends of social realism, bringing the experiences of the underprivileged into the mainstream. Roy has remarked in an interview at Kai Theatre that every society is an unjust society for sure, but the institutionalization of this is not questioned in the way that it should be questioned, and only fiction can connect various subjects. And so, through her fictional texts, Roy questions various authorities and addresses various issues faced by her homeland in the age of global capitalism. The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, published in 2017, is a perfect blend of interpersonal dialogues and historical and political documents of various issues and subjects which are called for. Roy makes use of the continuous intermingling of a diverse cast of characters from different cultural backgrounds and multiple languages, which is telling in itself of India's great diversity. It tells more than one story, intricately covering the past 20 years of Indian history, with each of the character as representative of an identity who is tossed and changed with the tide of events surrounding them. It shows how, despite having achieved independence from the British in 1947, India still witnessed the remnants of colonialism massively in varied forms within the nation state itself. India is one of the most religiously and ethnically diverse nations in the world. And because of this myriad religious and cultural diversity in India, there has been a history of violence and animosity between them. The artificial borders between East and West and the inferior superior dichotomy have long existed since the time of colonial rule. And these borders are experienced in different ways, even in post colonial era. These dividing lines are manifested by Roy in her narrative through various subjects like gender, caste, conversion, nationality, but most significantly through the use of transgender women. The British, coming to India, changed the society's circumstances in many ways, including the criminalization of all transgenders with the colonial law of 1897. Transgender people were accepted and understood in Indian civilization, but were made an other after the coming of the Britishers. With a new Supreme Court ruling and their efforts to decriminalize India's third gender people, today transgender Indians have achieved legal recognition. However, for many years, they were denied access to education, health services, and excluded from effectively participating in social and cultural life. And we see that the transgenders are till today accepted only within a narrow role, which Arundhati Roy calls special attention to in this novel. In the ministry, Roy takes us into an emotional journey into the lives of the transgenders, using Anjum, born Aftab, as a mouthpiece, who struggles to battle the various atrocities and stereotypes meted out to her, being a transgender and a Muslim minority. Aftab's struggle with his identity and self-discovery is indicative of the lives of thousands of Hijras struggling for acceptance and belonging in India at the time Roy wrote the novel. In an age of disinformation and misinformation, the Hijras become victims to various rumors, such as the idea that Hijra community kidnaps young boys and castrates them, and how killing Hijras would bring bad luck. The stereotypes are portrayed by Roy on many occasions, and one such is when Anjum, trying to help an abandoned child at the Jantra Mantra, a man from the crowd mocked at her, saying, I quote, you can't turn into one of you, can you? Modern technology has made great advances, but it hasn't got that far yet. Unquote. The man here was referring to the widely held belief that Hijras kidnapped male babies only to emasculate them. We see a border of gender running through them, just as India has a revolutionary border of nation or the East-West encounter. In order to see real progress, people must not just draw on a past that was submerged by colonialism, but also challenge it today for the better tomorrows. And the ministry takes part in the struggle of Hijras in debunking such stereotypical outlook. Anjum wanted to be a mother, and here Roy puts up a rhetorical question as to whether ambition such as this on the part of someone like Anjum reasonable or unreasonable. India is composed of a number of religious groups, and religious frictions run rampant. Roy has artistically represented in her work about how the minorities had to defy their identity in search of safety. Muslims like Anjum had to chant the Gayatri Mantra, which is a highly revered Hindu mantra, in mob situations where they could recite it in order to pass as Hindus. And in so doing, we find them letting go of a part of their individuality. India is also a home of more than 3,000 castes. Roy's strong disapproval with the caste system and the deadly consequences of familial and societal callousness relating to this system is apparent. Roy explores the class clashes and interpersonal conflicts that drive modern Indian society. Clearly, this intra-religious hatred is a resultant of colonialism with regard to who belongs and who does not. Given its multi-ethnic, multilingual, and multi-political reality of India, the bewildering multiplicity and diversity of political movements in the region is no surprise. The ministry is structurally, thematically, and stylistically a political novel. It blends personal stories with topical issues to explore contemporary India. The Gujarat Riot, which started in 1969, is regarded as the most lethal communal violence between Hindus and Muslims that involved a number of killings, which were visible in the further 2002 Gujarat pogrom. This riot also finds a mention in the novel. Every form of media covered the news about bomb blasts and terrorist attacks, merciless killings of young Muslim boys in what the police called encounters. The novel reiterates how war and riots break people. Anjum's experience in the Gujarat riot makes her develop a fear of living that forces her to take refuge among the dead, the graveyard. The thought that she was left alive only because she was considered a butcher's luck further aggravated her misery. Anjum's uncategorizable body is a powerful metaphor for the political fragmentation within India. More than anything else, Hijuras in this novel represent India itself. Roy depicts life after the partition of India and Pakistan, where a million people died of hatred. Neighbors turned on each other as though they had never known each other. Yes, this is one reality, but not the only reality. As the novel narrates bitter experiences of various characters, it also states their self discovery, which is perhaps the most important message that Roy imparts. Dramatized but single minded, Anjum sets up a guest house in a graveyard called the Jannat, and bit by bit begins to function as a funeral parlor which buried only those whom society had rejected. Amid many disturbing settings and obstacles, and despite all sort of disinformation about the Hijras and other minority groups, Roy shows her how her characters defy all negativity and emerge as an inspiration. Despite her aching history, Anjum does not let her bitter memories of the past overshadow her strength. And this is one strong indication that although our present is unquestionably shaped by our past, a traumatic past and dark history can be redefined. This also heightens the endless potentials of thought, of spirituality, of love, and of mankind. Although the consequences of the creation and perpetuation of Hindu Muslim antagonism by colonialism and the colonial project of divide and rule still affect Indians, that make it hard to look back without horror at the savagery of India's vivisection, the characters went on to win their own Indo-Pak war inside of them. This is Roy's literary and political account of great social mobility. The coming together of diverse culture and tradition also underscores unity in diversity in India. Through the means of storytelling, Roy questions the system of power and attempts to change it through the power embodied in literature. To bring things to a close, I would like to reiterate Roy's statement that every society is an unjust society for sure. But we can always seek greater grounding for an identity than that imposed by our dark past. With 28 states and 8 union territories, India definitely challenges how we can rise above adversities and puts forth the notion that change is always possible. And with that, I end my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Caroline, for your precise and very instigating talk on Roy's novels. I'm sure there will be some questions regarding her works, and you touched a lot of very sensible topics, themes that she brings in both her books, right? Books, by the way, that I really like reading and rereading. So thank you very much, Caroline. And now let's go to the second talk of this session. Now we're going to have Professor Viviane Madeira, and to whom I again thank a lot for accepting the invitation. And Viviane Souza Madeira received a bachelor's degree in Portuguese and English languages and literatures from the University of São Paulo in 2011. She completed her master's in 2016 and PhD in 2021 in Portuguese literature at the same university. Viviane participated in a split-site doctoral program internship at the Center for Comparative Studies of the Faculty of Arts of the University of Lisbon, funded by CAPES. Her general research focuses on Goan literature and culture. Under such scope, her master's dissertation discussed the construction of Goan identities in the novels Skin, by Margaret Mascarenhas, and A Casa Comboio by Raquel Ochoa. Her PhD thesis concentrated on the feminist struggle and the intellectual networks developed among Portuguese-speaking feminist writers in the first half of the 20th century. Viviane is a member of the thematic project Thinking Goa, a singular archive in Portuguese, and also contributes to the project Escritoras Portuguesas no Tempo da Ditadura Militar e do Estado Novo, organized by the IELT, the CISCS Nova Faces de Eva, from Nova University of Lisbon, School of Social Sciences and Humanities, and the Crilus, EA, Etudes Romanes, from the Paris-Nanterre University. And the title of Viviane's talk is The Articulation of Portuguese-Speaking Feminism, Connections Between Goan, Brazilian, and Portuguese Women Writers. Viviane, the stage is yours, the floor is yours, the screen is yours. Thank you again for being here with us.
Thank you, Professor Ivan. I'd like to thank you for your kind invitation. And I would also like to thank everybody who helped organizing this event, which is crucial at the time we're living. Well, as you said, my presentation is named The Articulation of Portuguese-Speaking Feminism, Connections Between Goan, Brazilian, and Portuguese Women Writers. And it's a part of my PhD thesis. So most of the corpus I will talk about today was collected during a split-site doctoral internship at the University of Lisbon, and also during 3 research field trips to Goa. So I'm going to share my screen. I hope everyone can see it. Well,
yes, we can see it.
All right, thank you. So let's go. The feminist struggle at the beginning of the 20th century was marked by the organization of associations that aimed to bring some balance to the disadvantages that women faced. Some of them were the prohibition to vote and limited access to education, which caused women to be economically dependent on their parents or husbands. The 1867 Portuguese Civil Code, which ruled not only the European country but also its former colonies in India, namely Goa, Daman-and-Diu, Dadra, and Nagar Valley, was especially restrictive to married women. It stated that only the husbands could manage the family assets and that they would have to give their wives legal authorization to take out a loan, acquire properties, and even publish books. In Brazil, women faced similar difficulties. In this paper, I intend to analyze the interactions between women writers from Portugal, Brazil, and Goa in India toward improving their conditions. I also aim to discuss the literary strategies they adopted to propagate their ideas on women's liberation. The works by women authors, which will be approached here in more depth, are the ones produced by the Goan writer Maria Ermelinda dos Estuartes Gomes and the Portuguese author Ana de Castro Osório. However, it is impossible to explain the path their texts and feminist idea took without at least mentioning the names of other women writers, such as the Portuguese Sara Beirão and Adelaide Cabete, as well as the Brazilian art activist Berta Lutz. Having said that, I begin my analysis by focusing on the Goan author Maria Ermelinda dos Estuartes Gomes. Gomes was born in Goa, more specifically in Xandor, Salsete, on June 9, 1889, and died in Lisbon in 1937. There is not much information about her life, but it is known that she was a teacher at a school in Ribandar when she was 23 years old, as announced in the Revista Colonial in the section Legislação e Despachos on April 25, 1913. Later on, she became a teacher at the Escola Normal de Nova Goa. In 1926, Gomes published the first volume of her book, Sumário da História Geral da Índia, which was named The Portuguese in India. In 1930, the second volume was published. The prefaces of both books were written by the Portuguese feminist and Republican activist Ana de Castro Osório. The first registered evidence I found showing that Osório and Gomes had connections was on the pages of A Semeadora, a periodical dedicated to feminist propaganda and edited by Osório. There, Gomes published 2 texts while still residing in Goa. The first one was published in 1917 and the second one in 1918. Both texts were written in 1917 as indicated in the periodical. In her first article, A Mulher na Índia Portuguesa, or Women in Portuguese India, Gomes uses a rhetorical technique, the captatio benevolentiae, Latin for winning of goodwill, which consists of capturing the goodwill of the audience at the beginning of an appeal so that they will adhere to the writer's cause. She does that by characterizing herself as a modest Indian and her article as meager. We can observe the use of the same technique when she commends the Portuguese patriotic crusade towards elevating women's position. In addition to that, she refers to some of the great women in the history of Portugal, such as the breadwoman of Aljubarrota, Queen Elizabeth of Portugal, and finally, she mentions a woman who is part of both Portuguese and Indian history, Isabel Fernandes. Fernandes fought at the battlefront against the Turkish in the Second Siege of Dio in 1546. After securing that her readers are captured by her introduction, she gradually moves on to talk about her main subject, which is the condition of women in the Portuguese colonies in India. Gomes considers that, and I quote her, even though the Indo-Portuguese are astonished by women's audacity to demand the extinction of the sexes before the law, end of quote, the efforts made in Goa to send daughters to school are commendable, and I quote her again, deserve to be valued and integrated at the bosom of what the Portuguese woman promotes in Portugal, end of quote. In order to contextualize the conditions Goan women face in the first half of the 20th century, Gomes writes about the ones who attended the liceus, or high schools, and the medical schools of Goa, as well as those who strove towards becoming midwives. Moreover, she makes a point regarding how the Hindu women living in Goa, the men and Diu, are still behind in comparison to the Christians, mainly because of early marriages. In the second article she wrote for the Portuguese periodical A Semeadora, Maria Ermelinda dos Estuartes Gomes resumes her approach to the condition of women in India from a historical point of view, aiming to discuss women's status since ancient times. And here I quote her. In my previous article, A Mulher na Índia Portuguesa, I mentioned the pre-Vedic and Vedic women who lived a glorious period that was singular in the universe. I believe this fact is not known by all women, even though it is definitely historically important to the cause that so many women fearlessly devote themselves to. That is why I, a woman who loves progress and is proud of being Indian, have to focus on it. People could never imagine that Hindu women played a prominent role in antiquity. If only they could take into consideration the conditions faced by contemporary Hindu women, who are kept away from social life, enclosed in a room as a silkworm in its cocoon, submissive and passive. End of quote. Even though Gomes uses and I quote here, Hilary Owen, a romantic and clearly Orientalist influenced vision of Indian history, end of quote, she uses that point of view as an argument to highlight that their decline took place after the patriarchal rise of Brahmins and Islam. And here I quoted Hilary Owen. Thus, she shows the reader that the intersection between gender and caste is also crucial to think about women's condition throughout history. Gomes' reflections are pertinent because they point to that women are, and I quote here, Weigel, in a singular point of exclusion, End of quote. As a consequence of acknowledging that, she seems to be interested in reconstructing and publicizing Indian women as relevant characters in history. Gomes is, according to Felipa Loundes, the first case of a Goan woman identified as feminist, even if the term has historically multiple and contested meanings. And, as we mentioned, she had connections in the metrópole with women who helped her publish in a Semeadora, Portugal Moderno, and Alma Feminina, in addition to presiding a section on education at the National Council of Portuguese Women. One of Gomes's connections in Portugal, as previously mentioned, was the Portuguese writer Ana de Castro Osório. Osório was a Republican and a feminist born in 1872 in Mangualde, Portugal, who died in 1935 in Lisbon. She was one of the most prominent advocates of feminism in early 20th century Portugal. Alongside Sara Beirão and Adelaide Cabete, about whom Maria Melinda dos Stuarts Gomes writes a homage, Osório founded and supported feminist associations, newspapers, and magazines, which fought for women's rights to vote, to get divorced, and to have an opportunity to study and to work. She was also one of the first writers to turn her attention to children's literature. Moreover, we can say that she was one of the greatest articulators to include Portuguese feminism in the international scenario, a fact that can be confirmed by the research that we have been carried out based on her espólio or her letters, integrated into the Arquivo de Cultura Portuguesa Contemporânea, guarded by the National Library of Portugal in Lisbon. In a letter sent to her father, João Batista de Castro, Ana de Castro Osório makes a comment on the relations she established in Brazil and states that, and I quote her, "Keeping these relations is always a good idea. I know you say you do not like meeting people. At first, I do not like it either, but my life is meeting new people." End of quote. Indeed, she corresponded with many women writers around the globe, including the German writers Carolina Michaelis and Louise, the Spanish author and feminist activist Carmen de Burgos, and the Brazilian feminists Berta Lutz and Maria Lacerda de Moura. Maria Ermelinda dos Stuarts Gomes was also among the writers Osório corresponded with. It's also through these letters that Osório put one writer in contact with other writers, as we can observe in the following excerpt taken from the letter written by Maria Ermelinda dos Stuarts Gomes after she had moved to Oporto from Goa. And here I quote her. "As soon as I received the letters you kindly sent me, I looked for Dona Filomena, who took me in with her natural kindness. She inquired about my friend very interestedly, and was extremely sorry that I had arrived at a moment when all her relations, including her children, were outside Oporto. Nevertheless, on the 25th, she and her husband took me to the editorial department of the Primeiro de Janeiro and Montanha, which were two periodicals. And yesterday, she offered a tea party for me, attended by Dona Sofia Grebon. She's really upset because you have not thanked her for the book she gave you. I spent an absolutely pleasant afternoon." We can observe here that Ana de Castro Osório put Gomes in contact with Dona Filomena because of that. She put Ana de Castro Osório put Gomes in contact with Dona Filomena, and because of that, Gomes was also able to establish relations with Sofia Grebon, the director of the periodical A Verdade in Macau. Likewise, Osório exchanges letters with Berta Lutz, a biologist and a founder of the Federação Brasileira para o Progresso Feminino. According to Eduardo da Cruz and Andrea Monteiro de Castro, Ana de Castro Osório, and I quote them, aims to disseminate Berta Lutz's actions in favor of feminism. O Século from Lisbon publishes an article about the feminist struggle and focuses on the role Berta plays in Brazil. The letters demonstrate the networks articulated by Ana towards that goal. End of quote. As Osório wishes to establish as many connections as she can, she sent a letter to Lutz on March 3, 1928, asking her about her relations with the Revista Feminina, a magazine published in São Paulo, Brazil, thus establishing another means to connect with the Brazilian public, one of her main goals. Nevertheless, she probably does that either because she wants to publish her own texts in the magazine or because she wants to establish yet another connection in the network she weaves. Interestingly, there is an article published by Maria Ermelinda dos Stuarts Gomes in O Heraldo on January 9, 1927, in which she mentions having received an issue of Revista Feminina sent to her by a renowned Portuguese woman writer, whom we believe to be Ana de Castro Osório, since she usually sends newspapers and magazines to those with whom she exchanged letters, a practice which seems to have been very common in the early years of the 20th century. Given that Gomes received and read the magazine for the first time in 1927, and a year later Osório asked Berta Lutz about her relations with the magazine editors, we can only suppose that Osório pulled some strings, not only for her to publish articles in the Brazilian periodical, which did happen, but she was also trying to open the way so that Maria Ermelinda dos Stuarts Gomes could publish there. Even though we cannot be completely sure that Osório mediated Gomes's relations with Avelina de Souza Salles, the director of Revista Feminina, because there is no concrete evidence on that, we can state that Gomes's connections with Osório somehow led her to sign a review about the book A Evolução do Feminismo, Subsídios para sua História, by the Luso-Brazilian writer Mariana Coelho in the Revista Feminina issue 238 in March 1934. In addition to stating her own opinions about Coelho's book, Gomes laments again that Indian women lost the prestigious position they had in Vedic and pre-Vedic times, and states that Indian history has a lot to contribute when it comes to including women in the historical narrative, as we see in the following excerpt from her article. And I quote her. When Coelho states that studying India is the same as reconnecting with the origins of humankind, she tells the truth. Indian civilization was paralyzed after the barbarian invasions, Arabs and Mughals, and alongside India, its women totally eclipsed. Now she has awakened from her long sleep that has taken many centuries. Thus, she bravely and respectfully has started to fight. Considering that collectively we are not free, Indian feminist has got diluted into nationalism, and many people are important for their knowledge, audacity, self-assurance, and serenity. Here we see two important elements in Gomes's discourse. The first one is more explicit and associated with, and I quote Chowdhury here, the 19th century package of ideas that claimed that the status of a nation ought to be gauged by the status of women, end of quote. Therefore, we can also infer that she was indeed trying to show to the Portuguese public that once the conditions of women improved back in India, the territory as a whole would achieve a new cultural level. This package of ideas that relates women's condition to a nation's civilizational progress is also a milestone in the discourse of European civilizing feminism, which, according to Françoise Vergès, aims to save racialized women from obscurantism. When setting European feminism as the final goal for Indo-Portuguese women, Gomes would be performing a mimic of civilizing feminism, which creates an ambiguity in her discourse, for she wants Hindu women to reconstruct a past untouched by colonization by using methods that were born as a consequence of colonialism. As for the second element, we can say it is connected to the impact colonialism and nationalism together had on feminism. When she states that they are not free as a group, and that this is why feminism is diluted in the national struggle, she also acknowledges that women have a double struggle, one to be part of a free nation, and the other one to secure their own personal freedom in that new nation. In brief, we can affirm that the thorough study of a privileged literary corpus composed of primary sources such as magazines, newspapers, and letters made it possible for us not only to have access to ideas that early 20th century women could not express on the pages of a periodical, but also to reconstruct the strategies they adopt to make their voices heard publicly. Ana de Castro Osório connected many feminists in Europe, Asia, and South America. And Maria Melinda dos Sturtes Gomes took advantage of Osório's ability to connect people to reach Portugal and Brazil with her texts and ideas, establishing her own connections with other feminist writers, such as the Portuguese Adelaide Cabete and Sara Beirão. Moreover, this intricate and useful network helped Gomes subvert the way history is narrated. A non-white, non-European woman is now able not only to narrate the history of India, but also to tell the history of women in India, even though it still excludes a great part of them, for she does not mention women who belong to lower castes or other classes. Later on, with the decolonization movement in the second half of the 20th century, new narratives of identity became relevant in their own contexts, again, holding on to a cohesive national identity to legitimate their narratives of self. As a consequence, other women struggled to find their ways inside the nationalist fight. However, this is a subject for another paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Viviane, for your amazing talk on the periodicals. Something that it's a topic that interests me a lot, and thank you very much for the information. It's I'm sure that the audience was also thrilled by your talk. I would like to invite to the stage Dr. Caroline and also Pedro. And just a few comments I would like to show to you and read here. We have the comment of Professor Raul Davis, who's here with us. Hello, Professor Raul. Thank you for watching us, for being here with us. Professor Cielo Griselda Festino complimented the talks of the speakers. Also, Ana Gabriela said that this was an amazing presentation. We have now room for some questions. We have here 2 questions from Professor Cielo Festino. I would like to start with the question to Caroline Hiro. How do you see Arundhati Roy today in the difficult context of India after the pandemics? So, Caroline, if you would like to talk a little bit about it.
Well, thank you for the question. Arundhati Roy has always voiced out the issues of those that are deliberately left unheard, and bringing the yes, and addressed the various issues that the people were, uncomfortable in addressing them. So even in the difficult context of India after the pandemics, I think, although she's a very controversial figure, no doubt, she still continues to, and through voices like her, India, there are a lot of yes.
Yeah, okay. As you know, just to connect to this question, I'm very curious about two things that you mentioned in your talk. The first is that when you said that hijras represent India in the Ministry of the Utmost Happiness. Um, I would like to ask you if the character of Amu in The God of Small Things also represented India 20 years before the ministry was published. Can you see a relation between these two symbols and these two identities in Roy's works that would somehow build a representation of India?
Yes. Just as the hijras symbolically represents India, the fragmentation in their political and religious um, arena. Although I cannot say much about Amul in the God of Small Things. Yes, they do represent India because Roy's character has always been a representation of India, the Greater India. So definitely they do represent, yes.
And yes, another thing I would like to point out is I would like you to relate, if possible, to relate to the caste issue, right? Because we have some classes of women, and I would like how feminism encompasses all of those, because we have the condition of the Hindu women, the Muslim women, um, the women of color, and the white women. So how is is it possible to say that there is a connection um, between a feminist view or a feminist perspective that would unite all these groups? Is it possible, or are they fragmented?
Well, it would be unfair to say that all of the experiences that each of this that you have mentioned are the same. No, it is not the same. But one thing that they share in common is they are doubly colonized, even in the letter of colonization. So this is one common feature that they share.
Okay, I'd like to ask a question as well. There's you mentioned storytelling, ancient storytelling in India, and the modern influences of European languages and culture. Yeah, how do these two come together in her latest novel, in Arundhati Roy's latest novel?
Well, more than anything else, the Ministry of Utmost Happiness is uh, a story of India, and it is a form of storytelling in the form of fiction writing. And yes, as I have mentioned, India has the ability of storytelling since the time of Rig Veda and Upanishad. But to bring this in the form of novel writing is something that the Indians have inherited from the West.
Now I'd like to address a question to Dr. Viviane, um, also from Professor Cielo Festino. She asks, what are the differences and similarities in the different forms of feminism as urged by Goan, Portuguese, and Brazilian women writers?
Well, thank you for the question, Cielo. I think that they have more similarities than differences. And actually, the thing that unites them is the civilizing feminism that, as Françoise Verger says, it was created during colonial times. Colonialism brought civilizing feminism along with it. And anyways, civilizing feminism focuses on giving women education, giving them independence for them to work and be, of course, independent from their families and from their husbands, parents, mainly for the married woman, because married women had almost no right. As soon as they got married, they lost rights over their bodies. They couldn't work or without the authorization of their husbands. They in Portugal they couldn't even publish any books without the authorization of husbands. So, but basically, what I think is the most important thing here, this feminine was aimed at the middle classes in Europe and here in Brazil as well. What I think that makes them all different is the national contexts. Because, for instance, in Goa, Maria Melinda dos Stuarts Gomes and another writer, Properta Correia Afonso de Figueiredo, they are the only feminists in early 20th century. They wanted to recreate and rescue, in a way, the history of women in not only in Goa but in India. So they have this worry, and I guess that's also because of the nationalist struggle that's right there, like by the door. So in the end of their lives, they are much closer to the nationalist struggle and try to think their feminism inside the nationalist fight. As for in Brazil, Berta Lutz, that I mentioned in my presentation, her feminism is very close to that of Ana de Castro Osório. So they have actually similar characteristics in the sense that it's a middle class feminism. They voting, for instance, was a central topic, and but it was not voting for all women. Like not all women would have the right to vote. So, and the same happened with Ana de Castro Osório, which was something they were very criticized about, like other feminists, such as here in Brazil, we have an anarcho-feminist writer and author, and Maria, I forgot her name. Her name escaped my mind. But anyways, we have this anarcho-feminist that she is she thinks completely different from Ana de Castro Osório, from Berta Lutz, even though they had connections and talked to each other and shared their ideas.
Sorry, I just have a question. It might be a bit too obvious, but what, apart from linguistic differences, what do you see are the main differences between feminist thoughts in Goa versus India and Brazil as well, of these authors?
Yeah, I believe that Goan feminism is not a big movement. Actually, I know that Goan feminists, there were two women that actually wrote about feminism, and even though they didn't say out loud that they were feminists, but in India there was already a developed movement that was walking alongside with the nationalist struggle. Of course, that Goan feminists, they knew that this was happening. They read, because Mumbai is close to Goa. So, and actually the press in Mumbai was circulating in Goa, and they were aware of the movement, but they were not as radical as the feminists from India. Also, and here is my hypothesis, is that also because they come from a Catholic background, and the feminists from Goa are Catholic, so they have some concerns regarding the role they play in their society as Catholics. As for Brazil, I believe that Brazilian feminism is much more diverse than Portuguese or Goan feminism, mainly because Brazil is enormous. So, and we have women talking about their rights since the 19th, 18th century, and even earlier than that, 16th, 17th century. There are women who individually, not as a movement, but individually, they demand their rights to learn, to be educated. So, and also, as I said, Maria Lacerda de Moura, that's the name of the feminist. She's like she's actually amazing because she's ahead of her time and ahead of the feminists of her time. So there are in Brazil, I believe that feminism is quite different from Goa, and in Portugal, of course, there are differences because we have again anarcho-feminists as well, feminists who are connected to communist and socialist movements. But if we compare Brazil and Goa, I believe that the movement here is much more diverse than there.
That's great. That's great. I would like to thank again for the two amazing talks. There are some comments here in the chat. Sushila Sushila is saying she's from Goa. Hi, Sushila. Good evening to you. I guess in Goa must be 9 hours ahead from us. Dr. Viviane, glad you studied Ermelinda Stewart Gomes. Also, Vitória Chioveto is saying congratulations. Sara Santana also congratulating. Ana Gabriela. Professor Cláudia Negro, who's going to be in our roundtable session together with Professor Cielo in the evening. She also greets you all. Okay, thank you very much for being here with us. Welder Gomes, congratulations, Caroline and Viviane. Professor Raul Davis is also here with us. Says congratulations too. And I guess Sushila also has one comment here, which I'm going to project. Propercia Correia Afonso and Ermelinda Stewart Gomes, to a large extent, represented their case backgrounds in Goan historiography. That is Bremen and Kshatriya viewpoints. Thank you. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, actually, I would. I don't know if it was clear when I was talking, but they belong to higher castes in India. So they represent this middle class, high caste point of view. So again, that's why they are so close to civilizing feminism, because to some extent they have the same ideas. They defend the same ideas, class and caste ideas.
Mm-hmm. All right. So, thanking you again. I would like to end this opening roundtable session. And I would like to make a live transition, because the link is the same, to the debate session with Professor William Nilan. He's already here with us. And Professor Daniel Padilha. Is Daniel with us? I don't know if he's with us. So and Fred is going to um, do the presentations, and I would like to thank you, Dr. Nylen, for being here with us in our event. Thank you very much for being here. And Fred, you can go on and do the introductions.
Yes, of course. Hello, everyone, again. I'm glad to be back. Today we have a very special guest from the University of Stetson, which is my alma mater. Dr. William Nilan is a professor of political science and the program director of the International Studies program at Stetson. He got his PhD from Columbia University, master's degree from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and bachelor's from the UC Berkeley. He has spent a lot of time working in Brazil, specifically in Campania, and his areas of study focus on political economy, comparative politics, and with a specific focus on Latin America and Mozambique. I would also want to mention that he is the Fulbright liaison at Stetson University. So I personally been talking to him a decent amount, as I actually ended up in Brazil and eventually the UFU. So I am very happy that he's here today, and I am excited to hear more about what he has to say. His speech will be about the failures of liberalism, the rise of post-liberal demagogues, and the prospects for Brazilian democracy. So I suppose without further ado, we can begin.
Thank you, Fred. Am I coming through clear here? Great. So let me just say that it's incredibly gratifying to see you here, here virtually with me, because you and I work together to some extent to get you there. And I'm really happy to be participating in this as part of your experience as well. Thank you to you and to the folks who have been instrumental in putting this together. Let me just say, as a way of introduction, and then I'll pull up a PowerPoint which I can follow through. But I've been studying politics in general, but also more specifically in Brazil for maybe almost 40 years. And I was present in some extent at the creation of the Brazilian current political regime. I was in Brasilia during the time of the Constitution of 1987, 1988. And I have followed Brazilian politics since then. Of course, at that time, we were very interested in the transformation and the transition of military-led regimes into democracies. It was a very positive time. Things would appear, as a believer in democracy, as you will see in my talk or here, these were times when we felt things were improving. And now, 35 years later or so, the political science literature is a little bit less positive, perhaps a little bit more doomy and gloomy. What I am, the presentation thing I'm going to give you today is really a kind of interpretation of mine, a person being able to look back at 35, 40 years of history where I've been actually physically present and involved in that. My interpretation of things that are going on. So having said that, let me share my presentation if I can do this correctly. Let's see. That's not coming up, is it? So let's see, my computer, PowerPoint. All right, hang on, because this is not my normal way of seeing these things work here. It looks like we're going to move in on this. It's processing. So as the technology is catching up, let me just say that I'm going to be presenting a presentation in like 4 or 5 large blocks, and so there we go. Great. And I'm going to hope that this works out on this. Bingo. Everything good? Good. So at any particular time, Fred, if you could kind of watch this, if there are questions along the way, please let me know, okay?
Will do.
I will begin now then. Liberal economic theory and liberal democratic theory have been the foundational political philosophies of the Western world for the last 250 years. Both are firmly based on the mechanism of competition, market competition and electoral competition. The legitimating principle of both is that no single individual or small group can control or influence the outcome of that competition. For example, in democracy, it's one person, one vote, and the majority rules. In the economy, it's the so-called invisible hand of rule-bound competition, where all contenders are price takers, not price makers. Outcomes of these competitive processes can be seen as just because the process of arriving at those outcomes was both free, all can enter the competition, and fair, none have any particular special advantage or privilege other than their own natural talents and know-how. In other words, competition and its legitimate outcomes are enabled by the existence and enforcement of very clear rules and laws that apply equally to all. And that's the promise of liberalism. And in the real world, free and fair competition has long been challenged, if not actually undermined, by the existence of monopolistic and oligopolistic markets, powerful lobbies, high-level corruption, corporate biased media, and ruling parties' attempts to use their supposedly temporary power to rewrite the rules and stay in power indefinitely. All of these practices entail concentrated power, subverting the rule of law, subverting the mechanisms of free and fair liberal competition. They combine to produce and even reinforce ever more extreme levels of socioeconomic and political inequality, thereby challenging the basic legitimacy of liberal capitalism and liberal democracy. It becomes increasingly obvious to anyone actually paying attention that supposedly liberal competition, rule-bound and universally applied, is as unequal in practice as are the outcomes it produces. When a significant number of citizens come to see that both liberal capitalism and liberal democracy have failed them, but at the same time, a select group or class of the powerful and well-connected have clearly benefited above all the rest. Scholars call such moments crises of legitimacy. In such moments, people may be willing to support any number of alternatives to liberalism. Now, to be sure, when economies are growing rapidly, when jobs are available and salaries are high, when futures look promising, when politicians spend and borrow freely, corruption is just how things get done, then mass publics tend to look the other way. As the saying goes, a rising tide lifts all boats, even if all boats are not lifted in the same degree. In boom times, capitalism saves liberal democracy by papering over its defects with dollar bills. But when the boom times end, when economies are stagnant, when jobs are scarce and salaries disappoint, when futures look dismal, when democratically elected politicians can't bring the good times back and are forced to deliver austerity and recession instead, when corruption appears obscene in the context of widespread scarcity, then mass publics are primed to look for the reasons behind their discontent and growing desperation. Most members of the mass public will not have had the privilege of studying macroeconomics, democratic theory, or international political economy. Most do not have the patience or even, dare I say it, the intelligence to understand the structural dynamics of late-stage capitalism or oligopoly capitalism and elitist and transactional or dando que se recebe forms of democracy. History shows us that mass publics tend to personalize their search for the reasons behind their discontent. And they tend to want to exact punishment. Who, not what, is to blame. And punishment only feels right when it's inflicted upon beings, not social systems or structures or regime types or subtypes. In such historical moments, powerful beneficiaries of the status quo are well poised to deliver easy answers to mass public's questions about who to blame and who to punish. Their right-wing answers, as we call them, conveniently ignore structural forces like late-stage capitalism, as well as the political influence of the powerful beneficiaries of the status quo. In providing easy answers for who, not what to blame, they tend to focus first on leftist politicians and intellectuals. The ones whose arguments and political programs, after all, tend to focus on identifying late-stage and oligopolistic capitalism and powerful beneficiaries of the status quo as being the most responsible for producing and reproducing the inequalities that mass publics feel in their declining prospects. The stronger these leftist arguments, the stronger the blame attached to their socialist, communist, radical, or unpatriotic proponents. Any amount of vitriol poured out on particularly intellectuals. But blame is also easily spread to include such common scapegoats as immigrants, poor people, members of the LGBTQ plus community, non-whites, Jews, Muslims, pacifists, human rights advocates, educated women, any group that a significant percentage of mass publics dislike, distrust, or simply don't recognize as being one of us. When anti-left, anti-intellectual, anti-scapegoat messages become personalized into the rhetoric of a single charismatic individual, and classical philosophy and political science call these individuals demagogues, then sizable numbers of the mass public can come to see this individual as the great leader who will defeat their enemies, the leftists, the intellectuals, etc., and bring the country back to a time, real or imagined, of greatness and prosperity, preferably to be shared amongst the deserving and the true believers. This is how relatively small but powerful groups of beneficiaries of the status quo find passionate support amongst those who are the verifiable victims of that very same status quo. This is what I have elsewhere called the caviar and ketchup coalition. It is in the grips of such right-wing elite mass coalitions, galvanized by a demagogic leader, that many liberal but faltering democracies find themselves today. The United States, Brazil, United Kingdom, Poland, Hungary, and India, to name some of the most prominent examples. What can be done to keep at-risk democracies from falling ever deeper into such an authoritarian downward spiral? This is the most important question that political science and democratic activists are asking in this third decade of the 21st century. Right-wing authoritarianism is the single most important challenge to the future of the once Western and now global project of freedom-driven liberal progress. More important, perhaps, than the question of how to solve the threat of climate change, because right-wing demagogues, with their adoring and unquestioning masses on the one side, and the powerfully wealthy, entrenched elites on the other, have no apparent interest in checking private and corporate power in order to tackle a collective problem, even if that problem is an existential one, like climate change. At this point, let's step back from the existential human global collective level of analysis and focus on one case study, a country near and dear to all of our hearts, Brazil. Brazil's particular right-wing demagogue, current president Jair Bolsonaro, embodies the by now familiar program of right-wing authoritarianism. More notable for what it is against than what it's actually for. Anti-progressivism, right? All policies aimed at diminishing socioeconomic inequalities, cultural inequalities, social inequalities of all types. Anti-globalism, anti-environmental protection, anti-LGBTQ+, anti-feminist, anti-corruption, anti-crime, anti-anything that is anti-Bolsonaro. In the end, just like all demagogues of the right or the left, Bolsonaro is also clearly anti-democracy. His threats not to accept a loss in Brazil's upcoming elections mirror the actions currently on display for all the world to see of his fellow right-wing demagogue in the United States, former President Donald Trump. Equally worrying in Brazil are Bolsonaro's open praises for and political grooming of ideologically aligned military and police forces. I want to argue, in spite of everything I've just said there regarding Brazil, that Brazil is actually well placed in recovering its faltering or liberal but faltering democracy, at least in comparison to other liberal but faltering democracies like Hungary, India, and the United States. Brazilians, in other words, have a better reason to be optimistic about their political future than do Hungarians, Indians, and United States of Americans. I argue that the best thing that Brazilian democracy has going for it is the fact that Bolsonaro is a man without a political party. And I have to apologize for this slide right here because I am unable to actually control the multiple levels of each individual slide. So these parties were supposed to come in sequence, and this is going to happen a couple of times more in my presentation, where what you're going to get is just the whole final slide rather than a sequence of overlays and slides on top of it. That's the technology that was just delivered to me. So I apologize for that in advance. But let's get back to the presentation then. I'm arguing that the best thing that Brazilian democracy has going for it these days is the fact that Bolsonaro is a man without a political party. So, what is Bolsonaro's party? He ran for president in 2018 under the Social Liberal Party, but then promptly left that party. Prior to that, he had served as a federal deputy for Rio de Janeiro under the Christian Democratic Party, the Social Christian Party, the Progressive Party, and 3 other minor political parties. He is currently running for re-election under the Partido Liberal, or the Liberal Party, a party label that has come and gone over the years since its original founding in the 1990s. All of these parties are small, essentially comprised of a handful of regional, local notables, powerful local level politicians or regional level politicians, loosely combined into programmatically ambiguous, other than being broadly conservative or pro-status quo, more or less national level parties. Partisan identities and loyalties amongst members and local operatives of these parties are notoriously fleeting and superficial. As a consequence, the ability of such parties to engage in long-term strategizing is next to nil. As most Brazilians know, such parties are not much more than electoral vehicles or partidos de aluguel, temporarily occupied every couple of years when and if the negotiated price for any given politician for hitching a ride is right. If we compare Bolsonaro to the right-wing nationalist demagogues of Hungary, such as Viktor Orbán, India, Narendra Modi, and the United States, Donald Trump, we see that all 3 of the latter have constructed or grafted themselves onto strong and durable political parties. Modi's Bharatiya Janata Party, for example, goes back to 1951. Modi joined the party in 1985 and rose through its ranks in the decades that followed. Orbán's party, Fidesz, was founded in 1988, then gradually personalized or occupied by Orbán and his followers over the next several decades. Donald Trump's party, the Republican Party, one of only 2 effective political parties in the United States, was founded in 1854, but was largely, albeit incompletely, personalized and occupied by Trump since his elevation as the party's candidate for president in 2016. As president, Trump inherited a decades-long partisan strategy of demonizing opponents with the help of allied media outlets and personalities, gradually filling the judicial branch of the government with ideological and partisan loyalists with the help of an organization called the Federalist Society, using their legislative caucuses at the state and federal levels to block and shut down virtually all efforts on the part of the Democratic Party to advance that party's legislative and judicial agendas. And finally, questioning the legitimacy of any electoral victories by the Democratic Party. In all three of these cases, the demagogic leaders whip up their supporters, right? So here's one of these things. These things are not supposed to be there yet. The demagogic leaders whip up their supporters to occupy the streets, the airwaves, and the social media feeds. Meanwhile, their political parties systematically and strategically infiltrate and occupy the state, promising relief from progressive policies of redistributive taxation and regulation in any number of under-the-table deals and privileges. Powerful economic elites are brought in to the resulting caviar and ketchup coalition to provide the resources needed for waging today's increasingly expensive media-driven electoral campaigns. And underneath these question marks here are supposed to be dollar bills representing the funding of the party and the candidates. So in Brazil, under Bolsonaro, only half of this strategy unfolds, and this part of the equation would have disappeared, the political strategies part, and all we get is this left side. Bolsonaro works hard to bring himself and his supporters into the streets, onto the airwaves, and into the social media feeds. He is the quintessential charismatic demagogue. But he has no disciplined political party with a long-term strategy of occupying the state and delivering the policies, deals, and privileges that powerful economic and political elites require in return for their electoral support and, most importantly, their campaign contributions. Ultimately, all Bolsonaro has to offer them is a warning that he is not as bad as a victory by former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, and that's where this would have come forward. As of this writing, with Lula leading the polls in the double digits, Bolsonaro's offer cannot seem all that compelling. That's the question marks right here. So scholars, political scientists have long commented and written about Brazil's weak and non-programmatic political parties. These writings have usually been seen, and these weaknesses of the political parties in Brazil have usually been seen in a negative light, as an impediment to Brazil's ongoing democratization. The irony here, if my argument is correct, is that weak parties are actually positive in keeping democracy alive in Brazil by helping to keep Bolsonaro's demagogic authoritarianism at bay. That may be an argument and a discussion that we want to have a little bit later. My particular argument about the weakness of Bolsonaro's strategy, or the one-sidedness in comparison to others who are similar to him, the Orbáns and the Modis and the Trumps of the world. That's something that I'd be happy to talk about. I want to move on with the argument, however. And again, this was supposed to be a series of slides that were supposed to come in over time, but we'll deal with what we got. Democracy is as a kind of bit of a review of what I've been arguing. Democracy worldwide is in crisis. Liberalism worldwide is in crisis. Liberal capitalism and liberal democracy have failed to fulfill their promise of delivering a better life to hardworking and voting majorities. Instead, we get staggering and worsening inequalities and political elites who don't seem to be able to do anything about these problems. Into these crises have stepped demagogues who promise us something else, punishment for the enemies they identify for us. Unfortunately, the enemies they identify for us are rarely, if ever, the ones actually responsible for the inequalities and the disappointments that plague us. By the time we figure this out, democracy may have become a thing of the past. Elections may still take place, but the demagogue and his ruling party always seem to win. The British politician Winston Churchill once said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." Numerous academic crisis theories of change point out that significant political change tends to occur in periods of what some scholars call legitimation crises, hegemonic crises, critical junctures, and still others, points of vulnerability. Regardless of the label, the fact is that such crises are precisely the times when human agency, individual action, and collective action really matter. Political institutions and standard operating procedures no longer have the same hold on people's loyalties and behavior. Elites fight amongst themselves. Mass publics become increasingly disengaged from these struggles and from the organizations that participate in them. Long-standing elite socioeconomic and political coalitions show themselves and their members to be incapable of establishing order and deference. Change becomes possible, even likely, though to be sure, there's no guarantee that that change will necessarily be for the better. And therein lies the threat here at the bottom of the wake up and smell the fascism. In these periods of crisis, where existing ideas and existing institutions and organizations that were built around those ideas are clearly not working, there is a possibility of change. In some cases, however, that ideational struggle does not produce change, or at least it produces change in a very, very different direction. And that is a problem of where we are today, I would argue. Again, this is one of those wonderful slides I put together that I'll talk through now. But it is, let's say, so change becomes possible, and there's no guarantee that it could be necessarily in a positive direction. It's therefore critically important for all of us to recognize that this is precisely the time that we need to pick sides and take action because the basic currency of such major crises is conflict. Conflict over ideas, conflict over plans, visions of the future, and conflict over the power to direct the change that is possible, even likely. The clear and present danger for the U.S., for Brazil, and for many other countries is the final destination of fully realized right-wing nationalist demagoguery, which is fascism. If allowed to take hold, fascism would be the violent end of all that makes modern life possible and most enjoyable, at least for those of us who have been able to enjoy the benefits of modernity and who still see the promise of liberalism. I'm talking about science, literature, art, music, social science, environmental preservation, the environment as natural spaces, pluralism in all its varieties, religious pluralism, ethnic pluralism, sexual orientation pluralism. Fascism is against it all. In its stead, it promises a community of sameness, rigid hierarchies constructed upon institutionalized fear and violence, and punishment for the official scapegoats and all who refuse to conform. Surely, universities, students, professors, staff should be on the front lines of fighting against such an existential threat. And in this, I have the building here from Stetson University. This is one of our buildings here on the campus. And I put it here because of the large lettering in stone on the balustrade there. Education is power. Education is power. And it's precisely that power that is that is in the crosshairs, is threatened by the rise of right-wing demagogic authoritarianism and fascism. The freedom of scientific inquiry, for example, the freedom to test and challenge and potentially upend the received wisdom of yesterday. This lies at the very heart of modern civilization, including the cell phone or computer in your hands, the network of digital connectivity that makes this presentation even possible, and the multiple medical advances that have allowed many of us to simply be alive today. By the same token, artistic freedom, freedom to push the boundaries of taste and creative expression gives us exciting new ways, often shocking at first, but new ways to engage the creative side of our brains. What then does one fight for when fighting against the threat of fascism? We fight for these things, for the freedom to innovate and create, or as liberals would have it, the freedom for each one of us to compete and potentially to emerge victorious from that competition for the benefit of ourselves, but also for the ultimate benefit of all. If we understand that the modern university was built upon such liberal principles, and it was, then we must always fight against the threat of fascism's project to shut it all down. But especially now, as it rears its ugly but charismatic head once again. Now, it's worth asking if outside the academy, outside the struggle for the very foundation of university and civilizational life, in the world of politics and economics, are we doomed to struggle only for the lesser of two equals? A frustratingly flawed system of liberal democracy elitist democracy, some call it, and an almost laughably illiberal system of oligopolistic late-stage capitalism. To fight merely for the status quo is to fight for the very system that is in crisis, the very system that has allowed the specter of fascism to present itself as an attractive option to so many disengaged and disappointed people. I believe that we cannot let this crisis go to waste. I believe that the best option is true liberalism. And in this, I am going to be moving into the final step and stage of this presentation. I want to leave us with some positive ideas and positive feelings. Yes, liberalism has failed to a large extent. Its promise was exalting, and yet its realizations, particularly in the 21st century in many parts of the world, not so much. We are experiencing a wave of right-wing authoritarian populism, demagoguery, that is bordering and threatening to turn into fascism. It would be the negation of everything that 250 years of progress, for all of its inequalities, has given us. It is a time, this time of crisis, where our actions matter, precisely because we are not locked into a system that is working like clockwork. The clockworks are broken. People realize that, and that's an opportunity for us to participate in the debate and the struggle to make things better. How to make things better. Part of it is just to struggle against the specter of something that is infinitely worse. But in addition, I believe that there is something to strive for, and I'm calling it a true liberalism. This is not my invention. It's really a kind of continuation of an argument made in the early 20th century by this guy named Bertolt Brecht, positive freedom. Let's talk a little bit about that. True liberalism fights for equality of opportunity, freedom to compete for all citizens. This means that we fight for whatever policies and programs can effectively break apart and redistribute resources from the powerful beneficiaries of the status quo to those who would like to participate in the competition, be it educational or occupational or political, but simply don't have the resources and opportunities to do so. This has been called positive freedom, moving beyond freedom from unjust exclusionary laws. So think legal discrimination against any number of scapegoats, like pregnant women now here in the United States, to freedom to actually engage in the competitive struggles of the market and democracy promised by liberalism. Positive freedom delivered by a democratic state brings all citizens up to the level where their natural talents are recognized and cultivated, primarily through well-funded public education at all levels. Inherited privileges and are thereby minimized, if not eliminated, and the competition that ensues is finally and actually free and fair. True liberalism, based on positive freedom, costs money. No way around that. The powerful beneficiaries of the status quo, the ones who have most of the money and typically most of the power, will always fight it. They are rarely, if ever, the allies of true liberalism. If push comes to shove, if politics gets intense, as in today's crises of democratic legitimacy, if these elites do not support one authoritarian demagogue, they will search for another, or they will call their friends in the military and police to do their bidding. This is the struggle. It's not unusual. In fact, it's normal. This is normal politics in a liberal capitalist system. What is unusual is that at this point in time, during this crisis of ideas and political economic programs, we actually have the chance to make a difference in pushing history in a positive direction. There is, of course, a countervailing tendency, and we see it today all around us. The tendency to throw up our hands and give up, to retreat into one's private world, one's tiny world of social media friends, one's favorite medium of escapist entertainment, one's favorite intoxicant, one's chance to levar vantagem de tudo and make out like a bandit. It's our choice. It's our choice. In this day and age, our choice, I want to emphasize again, it actually matters. And we should choose wisely, choose correctly. Let's choose well. Seriously, let's choose well. Thank you. That's my talk. And I'm happy to entertain any questions or discussion or what have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Actually, I believe we did have a few questions.
Great.
One of them was in regards to a quotation, I think, on the first section of your presentation about citizens' perceptions of themselves being affected by the failure of their government and or their government's misguided position.
Mm-hmm.
Could you perhaps talk a little bit to that quotation?
So I think that what we see is that we are citizens, and I'm trying to kind of suss out this question because it's not directly jumping out of what I'm remembering in my presentation, but we're promised in some sort of vision of the social contract behind liberal democratic theory that given a certain set of laws that send us into the competitive struggle where we are, forced to compete at the level of as business people for producing better and more efficient products or what have you. As workers, working hard to get recognized, etc. The idea of all of that is that we accept these structures in order to emerge from that, having put our time and effort in, with the real possibility of making our lives better, right? And the structures that put all of that in place are really in the hands of the political system, right? I mean, the institutional design that makes these things function is in the hands of politicians. And to the extent that people recognize that the game is not playing out as promised, right? That hard work actually pays off, and that increasingly, and we see that in the inequality figures, right? Where more and more of the benefits. For example, here in the United States, since the 1980s, salaries and wages have essentially been flat for most of the population, if not declining, whereas for the top 10%, they actually have been increasing. So the world is getting better for a small number of folks. And that increasingly, even if people don't necessarily see it in those nice terms, they understand that it's not fair, that it's not working out for them. And that provides the opportunities for more and more people to essentially conclude that the whole system is not working. And that then provides the opportunity for voices to come in and start telling them who's at fault, right? And that's what my argument is, that the most well-funded voices, right, the media outlets and the folks that have the biggest think tanks are able to flood this area, this period of historical uncertainty and dissatisfaction with we might call it misinformation or disinformation or conspiracy theories, but oftentimes it's also scapegoating. It's the illegal immigrants' faults. It's gay and lesbian people's faults. And that's pretty much where I'm going. I'm hoping I answered the question correctly to the person's satisfaction.
I think you did. They sent some claps in the chat.
Okay.
I think Professor Danielle wanted to ask a question next.
Please.
First of all, I would like to thank you for your talk. It's really a pleasure for me to discuss with you about Brazilian politics. I have to say, you are a specialist in Brazilian politics. I'm not. I must say, I'm not even a social scientist or a political analyst. I'm just an observer of a political situation in Brazil, just a Brazilian citizen. Your talk certainly raises a number of interesting points, but I was asked to raise some discussion and even some controversy. So I'll try to stick to my role, and I will raise a couple of issues that, from my point of view, that is from someone who has just been observing Brazilian politics on a daily basis, could be discussed in your talk. I'd like to start with your main point, which is the liability of Bolsonaro's political party. You understand Brazil is in a good position to get rid of Bolsonaro since, I quote, Bolsonaro is a man without a political party, right? I agree that in other countries such as the U.S., Hungary, and India, the ones you used as an example, it would be hard for a candidate to win an election without a strong party. Trump himself tried to be nominated by the Reform Party in '99 and even won the primaries in York, California and in Michigan, but dropped out of the race later, right? On the other hand, the Brazilian party system and even the Brazilian political system is much different than those examples. And even in France, for example, Macron won the last two elections without a strong party. And the same thing happened in Brazil in the last elections, we have to recognize. Besides, I'm not sure Bolsonaro is really a man without a political party. I would love to share this optimistic view with you, but I'm sorry to say I really don't think so. I mean, Bolsonaro did win last elections with a very small party, Social Christian Party. On the other hand, right now, he doesn't belong to a weak party at all. His party, the Liberal Party, PL, is the main party in the Brazilian parliament. By the way, it has 77 congressmen, more than any other party. The next two parties in our parliament, Partido Progressista, Progressive Party, and the Labour Party, Partido dos Trabalhadores, have only 56 congressmen each. Moreover, PL, the Liberal Party, is one of the main parties of a huge coalition of parties called Centrão, as you well know. This coalition has been ruling the country for more than 3 decades now, that is, during the entire New Republic. Third, and most of all, he is the elected president. He has the control of the central power, and he's using it in the biggest electoral fraud of Brazilian New Republic. Economists evaluate the last amendment of the Constitution, which we call PEC, will cost up to 100 billion. As you know, the Brazilian budget, which is around 1.6 trillion, has only 120 billion to be spent freely, since the rest is already engaged in the payment of public service salaries, pensions, and interests of the public debt. Secondly, I must say I have some difficulties with your concept of anti-liberal demagogues when it comes to define leaders as Bolsonaro or Donald Trump or even Boris Johnson. I agree they are very authoritarian and even anti-democratic, but they are all ultra-liberal, not at all anti-liberal from my point of view. When it comes to the liberal economic theory, they are as orthodox as they can be. Bolsonaro is an ultra-liberal, Trump is an ultra-liberal, Boris Johnson, who has just resigned this morning, is an ultra-liberal. This is why I would not call them anti-liberal, even if they are very, very authoritarian and even anti-democratic. This is why I would call them anti-democratic and ultra-liberal leaders. And I wouldn't consider it a new phenomena in Latin America. Even with all the changes Bolsonaro administration has undergone, it kept his economic minister, Paulo Guedes, who campaigned with Bolsonaro since the beginning. Guedes worked in Universidad de Chile during the military dictatorship of Chile, and he watched in firsthand the reforms the Chicago Boys put in place in Chile. Paulo Guedes, the strongman of the economic policies of the Bolsonaro administration, is known for being ideologically very close to the Chicago Boys, a group of Chilean economists proeminent around the 70s and the 80s, the majority of whom were educated at the Department of Economics in the University of Chicago under Milton Friedman and Arnold Harberger. At the same time, he worked in the University of Chile. Paulo Guedes, at the same time he worked there, he stated that he intended to carry out in Brazil the reforms that were carried out in Pinochet's Chile. From this point of view, Chile started the new liberal policies in Latin America in the beginning of the 70s, and the army was a key player in those policies. Pinochet himself was a military and came from the ranks of Chilean army. He can be considered the first of those anti-democratic and ultra-liberal leaders of Latin America. Bolsonaro was also in the military before becoming a politician. And by the way, he has made his entire career working for the benefit of the public service pensions and salaries of Brazilian army, and still does. You started your talk with the beginning of classical liberal theories in the Enlightenment, and you insisted on its principles. But when it comes the way it works in different countries, the story sometimes is slightly different. So I would like to finish asking you for your input on neoliberalism in special in Latin America, considering the last 50 years, in light of those anti-democratic and ultra-liberal leaders, beginning with Pinochet up to our President Bolsonaro. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Those are excellent questions. And I'm going to start with the second one about ultra neoliberalism first, because that's the one that's really sticking in my head these days. And then we'll go back and talk a little bit about the political party critique. I would not trying to cop out for any things, but I would really agree with a lot of what you're saying when you're talking about the ultra neoliberalism. to me, this is part of the package of the failure of liberalism. It's inequality producing outcomes. When I'm doubling, when I'm really, if you look at the presentation, I'm really mostly looking at how the political side of liberalism has dealt with that, rather than reforming itself, right, in a more social democratic direction, which is, I think, the direction that I would argue so-called true liberalism or positive freedom is all about. It has moved into this increasingly intransigent political system situation where, on the one hand, there is all this blaming and scapegoating and trying to distract people's attention from the actual socioeconomic implications of liberalism or even ultra extreme neoliberalism. And then this kind of constructing of a political illiberal edifice on top of all of that. So that would be my first response, and in which case I'm kind of agreeing with you that that these demagogues are not necessarily, they're anti-liberal in the political realm, but they tend to, since they are oftentimes doing the bidding of the beneficiaries of the status quo, they are also promoting this kind of ultra neoliberal program. But I mean, I would only argue that a couple of things that, this is the struggle that, liberal capitalism has been undergoing since the 19th century, right? This effort to either reform or clamp down on reform through any number of authoritarian mechanisms. And in that, you're absolutely correct. This is not new, right? This is part of what we do, what has happened under liberal capitalism and liberal democracy. There are moments where I get back to this is the punctuated equilibrium or historical institutionalist theory that I'm kind of borrowing from people like Daryl Acemoglu and Robinson, James Robinson, these idea of critical junctures. There are moments when, like during the Great Depression, and I would argue sometime around now, where, there are possibilities where we could get back on track to true liberalism, positive freedom, or we can go down the rabbit hole of authoritarian fascism. And I think we're in that kind of a moment. And part of what I'm trying to do is rescue agency so that people don't just go, oh, well, it's too late, we can't do anything, right? And I really believe that, at certain moments we have to stand up and at least intellectually make the argument that we need to we need to promote this political opening and political system that is better than fascism, for God's sake. Let me just say one last thing on this point before I go to the other, that, Donald Trump is not an ultra liberal, right? He has moved us and increasingly into a world of more nationalistic economics, right? So, the trade wars with China, that kind of thing. And Biden hasn't really dialed it back a lot, right? But we're moving into a world, perhaps at least from the end of countries like the United States, that we don't know yet. That we don't know whether we are going to be still promoting this idea of globalization. Here in the United States, the supply chain disruptions from the pandemic have really delegitimated that notion of the global workplace and the global factory. There are a lot of, on both sides of the political system, folks talking about incentivizing factories to return. That's not just a kind of democratic or nationalistic thing. That's now seen even by people in the Pentagon arguing that this kind of strategic nationalism may be something that we need to do in the future. But let me go back to your first point about Bolsonaro not having a party. Point is well taken. Parties are important as an electoral vehicle, and I think that that's true. Bolsonaro had a party, and he has he's put these together, these coalitions. Macron, certainly without much of a party, was able to get elected. I think what I want to separate out is the electoral function of the party to this idea of a long-term strategic kind of project that I see not even the Central has. Because when I'm not a specialist on the Central, but I would argue that the Central's primary function is basically to put brakes on any kind of land reform or progressive taxation reforms, but it's fundamentally about putting members of the Central into government and into positions of power so they can have roles to play in the bureaucracy and salaries that they can distribute among their supporters. I think first and foremost, that's the Central's, and that's not a project, right? That's kind of an extension of the Partido de Aluguel. It is powerful to put the brakes on certain kinds of policies. I wonder, and I say this with all honesty, I wonder to what extent the Bolsonaros or anybody else in that area of this political spectrum in Brazil are able to get any kind of organizational, institutional strategy that lasts longer than one electoral cycle. And that's the thing that's fascinating about these other cases that I discussed. And of course, in the United States, we're seeing that starting in the 1980s and the 90s, doubled in on the Congress side, this strategy of long-term transformation, which we're now seeing fully realized in the Supreme Court, right, where they're able to start cutting down the victories of, progressive juridical decisions over the last century. As also there began the occupation of school boards at the local level, the occupation of state legislative branches, and so they're able then to start changing the electoral machinery. This has been a strategy going all the way back to the 1980s and 90s. And that's not even talking about, the Orban strategies that, again, though, this idea of not just an individual, but an entire cadre of people institutionalized with all kinds of links down to people who are all working on a similar, if not the same, long-term project. I don't see that in Brazil. And I take a certain amount of hope from that, seeing the other side of it, And I would hope that hope is actually substantive in some way. I hope I responded well enough.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Close reading of my document, and those are really good comments. I appreciate those.
Thank you for your answers.
If I can go ahead, there's a few more questions in the chat.
Please.
So I'm going to focus on a couple of questions here from one of the participants. And the first one is basically asking for an honest review of the Venezuelan political model. And then the next one compares that with Chile, Peru, and Colombia's new elected governments. So I'll put this first one here, and then perhaps we can move on to the next one following that.
Boy. So the Venezuelan political model if we want to talk about the Chavista model that Hugo Chavez originally put in place, based essentially on a challenge to the neoliberal system that the United States, or the Washington Consensus, imposed on Latin America in terms of, structural adjustment policies when there are, basic debts and crises, these kinds of things, and also increasing free trade or free trade agreements, whether they're bilateral or multilateral. All of this, Chavez came in to try to isolate to some extent, or to put it in a better way, to create a more regional-based model in which Venezuela was going to be the kind of powerhouse behind that. And the idea of, and the foundation of that was oil wealth, right? And the ALBA, ALBA, and various other initiatives at the international level brought in countries like Ecuador with Rafael Correa and Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, and a bunch of countries came in to try to work this out as an alternative to IMF structural adjustment, that sort of thing. So that's one aspect of the model. And the other aspect of the model was the domestic one, right? Where there were efforts to place a kind of participatory branch of the federal government in neighborhoods. I don't know a ton about that, but let me just kind of cut to the chase. And this is something that we all know, right? When those international and domestic initiatives, incredibly audacious, to be honest, and sincere on the part of Chavez, whether they were right or wrong, I'm not going to go into that, but certainly a sincere effort, 100% dependent upon the resources provided by Venezuelan petroleum, right? And when the price went to the other direction, right? Also, no, I shouldn't say 100% dependent on petroleum, because there was at least a big percentage of it dependent upon Hugo Chavez as a charismatic, left-wing, kind of demagogic populist guy. So Chavez dies of cancer. Maduro, who is this kind of, not terribly exciting guy, it's hard to live in the shadow of a charismatic person. And he was definitely in the shadow. And so he emerges and is not a very powerful leader, and immediately gets hit by the downswing of petroleum prices. And then the whole model begins to just disintegrate because basically it's like an organism with a full hemorrhage. The blood is pouring out, and the basic logic within that system is everybody's out to protect their own little piece of it, and the whole collective thing falls apart. So I think that the Venezuelan political model, for all of its effort to generate solidarity abroad and at home, was fundamentally flawed by being overly personalistic and overly based on a single commodity in a world where commodity prices go up and down. And this was not a sustainable model. Even if it had been a great one, it was unsustainable. And that's where we are now. So the whole thing collapses, and then you get this military aligned party group in power who refuse to let go, and the whole state begins to collapse. But they're actually in there holding things together for themselves, and it's a mess. It's a mess. That's my honest assessment of that model. And it's not because of its ideological components, right? It's because it was, whether it had been a populist right-wing thing, even fascist, it would still have collapsed on those two fundamentally flawed components of personalism and single commodity foundation. The Chilean, Peruvian, and Colombian. So we're dealing with a second so-called pink tide now. Chile, Peru, Colombia, that is a new wave of left-wing leaders. Perhaps if Lula wins again, right, a very moderate leftist come in power, this is a new kind of resurgence. How will they be able to do? Commodity prices will be critical, as they were. Lula did a great job in his first couple of terms of office, at least, by most standards. And part of it was that the economy was doing extremely well, and he was able to do what he did without breaking the country's bank or having to impose austerity on folks. His successor, not so much. She got caught with that external environment changing, and she tried to spin through it, and that didn't work out terribly well. Look, I think that Chile and Colombia have very positive prospects. Chile has a much more diversified economy than Peru. Colombia potentially has a diversified economy. Its politics, we'll see. The right wing in Colombia has not been historically very amenable to cooperating and collaborating with leftists. There's a lot of bad blood between them, and there's a lot of power and concentrated illicit violence in the hands of paramilitaries and in the military itself in Colombia that could derail this, as it has in instances in the past. But there's also a large percentage of the population in Colombia are just tired of the violence, and we'll see how they're able to turn that into a positive support for the government, and see if the government can actually begin to make a positive impact on people's lives through, again, redistributive policies. In Latin America, the problem with neoliberalism has always been it concentrates income, it concentrates wealth, and that's not what this part of the world needs in this particular context. People emerging from the pandemic are hurting. They are back into periods of levels of poverty that we left 30 years ago. The last thing that needs to happen is further concentration of wealth when people are in such desperate situations. So I think that's why we're seeing a resurgence of the left. The left actually has those proposals. Whether they'll be able to push them through, is unfortunately, time will tell. So
thank you so much.
My brilliant commentary. Sorry.
No, thank you. No need to apologize. So I think we have one more question, and I'll put it on the screen here. But it says, "What about no liberalism at all? Isn't the liberal system and politics meant to doom us all? What do you think about it?" So we might have to, if you can add a little context to that.
Sure.
Louisa.
Well, I think, look, some people, many people on both the left and the right, through multiple generations, have made the argument that sort of what's upon a time sort of Marxist, sort of real Marxists would say bourgeois capitalism, right? Bourgeois liberalism is really meant to provide us with all kinds of beautiful images of competition and beautiful images of freedom and equality, and it's a facade, right? So the Marxist critique was always that's a facade, and on the right, on the fascist side, was it's chaos. It's basically, so-called pluralism with each individual being able to do what they want. This, that, and the other is just a recipe for society kind of at each other's throats all the time and hating each other. And so both sides on extremes have always said that we have a plan, right? Whether it's the Marxist plan to basically eliminate liberal capitalism and put it in the hold of the state, and a political party that understands the issue and understands through basically technical means that we can make markets function for the betterment of society as a whole. And on the far right side, on the fascist side, it's we basically understand that the veneration of a great nation requires all of us to make sacrifices in the benefit of the greater good. And that greater good is defined by the party, right? The people who know what it's all about, who have occupied the state. And the ideology then becomes one of national greatness, and usually, sort of turned against whoever the enemy is on the other side of the border or within our own borders. And look, and I'm not saying those are the exclusive only options outside of liberalism, but they are indicative of oftentimes what people want to do when getting rid of liberalism is getting rid of the exploitative aspects of it, the wasteful aspects of the competition and the fighting, right? And to impose some sort of real solution. And I'm just, the older I get, the more skeptical I am of the final solutions, right? I just don't trust people. I mean, I look at history. I see the Pol Pots and the killing fields of Cambodia as one idea, and then the Holocaust death camps on the other side, and various forms of genocide when people decide they've got the solution, and it entails telling those people to shut up or getting rid of in the end. I like this idea about liberalism, which is, and that's the political liberalism, right? Ballots, not bullets, shouting, not shooting, and all of the instability that entails. I think, that's better than authoritarianism. I just, in the end, don't like authoritarianism. And I guess, and if there's an other non-liberal strategy out there that doesn't entail, repression of people that disagree, then I'd love to hear about it.
Well, thank you for that. Definitely real good. Really interesting to think about that in a historical context as well. I think we do have another question, this time about China's Belt and Road Initiative and its effect in the Southern Cone.
This thought in China's Belt. So I'm not going to pretend to be a specialist on this. I did, however, just come back from spending 6 weeks in Ecuador. And Ecuador, over the last decade or so, is an example of a country that has really turned its trade and economic prospects much more towards China than the U.S. and Europe, as it in comparison to its past. And that makes all the sense in the world for a number of reasons. China offers countries seemingly, and I saw this when I was in Mozambique as well, throughout East Africa, China offers deals to governments that are really hard to turn down. Financing agreements, long-term. China is using its economic power to purchase ever more presence throughout the world. And why wouldn't it? Why? I mean, any country and all countries in the past, whether it was England in the 19th century and the United States in the 20th century, there is an inevitable, it seems, effort on the part of rising powers to expand their presence, their physical presence, not just their economic kind of ties. And those two are not mutually exclusive. So the benefits can be obvious, but there are downsides as well. Ecuador and certain countries, when they are unable to pay at first quite positive arrangements or negotiated deals, China can actually literally occupy and take over the territory. I know Sri Lanka has a port that is now essentially Chinese. Ecuador has a refinery, I think, that is essentially transferred over that. Private property being private property is, but this is not necessarily, this is a state owning this particular portion of a country. That may or may not be alarming. I don't know, but it's different, right? It's one thing if AT&T owns a chunk of your land, or General Motors. It's another thing if the United States government or the Chinese government owns a chunk of your land. And this is kind of a different thing. China, the final thing I'll say on this is China, like any other country, has its ups and downs on its economic cycles right now because of its policies about COVID. Its economy has slowed down to a certain extent, and that if you're tying 100% or a huge portion of your economic future to China's, you're going to have that's going to affect you in the same way that it did when you're tied to the United States. Look, Latin America, Africa, any number of countries throughout the world, having been structured into the global division of labor as primary product producers, right? I mean, there's neo-extractivism in Ecuador and Brazil, soybeans, pork bellies, whatever they are, when the foreign market is the predominant influence, you as an economy that is increasingly dependent upon that foreign market have no control over what that market generates, whether it's demand or recession. And, the basic economic formula, which I think Brazil has done actually pretty well, in spite of its going back into this kind of neo-extractivism, though, is diversification. What you don't want to do, like Ecuador, is have like a huge percentage of or Venezuela, right, where a huge percentage of your economy is dependent upon a single commodity. Right? If you can spread those out and diversify not only your commodities, but diversify your trading partners, this is an insurance policy, right? And so to the extent that Chile has done that, and it has too, mostly raw materials or primary products or basic products rooted in agricultural or mineral production, but it's diversified those. And that helps Chile become a little bit more resistant and resilient.
Okay, so in terms of other questions, I mean, we have some comments about the different countries and their capacities to produce certain economic goods, but I'm curious if perhaps Professor Danielle had any other comments to make. I have like a question I did want to ask, but I want to present that opportunity for Professor Danielle.
Oh, please, Fred, go ahead. Don't hesitate.
Okay. So I suppose my own question has to do with perhaps how the institutions here in Brazil might be more resistant to, we'll say, the loss of democratization than the United States. Could you talk about that a little bit?
I've never thought about that, to be honest, whether I think, first of all, I mean, the United States, from being a country that has not fallen completely to a military intervention or an authoritarian reversal for a very long time, makes us perhaps less resilient, less likely to feel that, you know, it could happen here. There's a, you know, and so I think maybe that, but on the other hand, I look back. I mean, right now, I don't know if y'all are watching some of these hearings that are coming out of the January 6th committee and in the U.S. Congress, where, and this gives me great hope, to be honest, because what I'm seeing not only is a partisan effort to shine light on a dark episode in our history, but I'm also seeing Republicans, not just Liz Cheney and the other congressmen who are part of the committee, but I'm seeing dedicated Republicans who, in some cases, worked for the administration and emerging as not partisans, but believers in the rule of law and the Constitution for all of its flaws, right? People who stood up and said, I will resign if we do this, right? Or I'm sorry, that's not going to happen. That's illegal. I won't attach myself to that. And so within the Republican Party, we are being shown a still strong belief among a significant faction of the Republican Party, and particularly Republicans who are in the state in various, you know, positions as you know, high-level bureaucrats, and in some cases even appointed officials, standing up for the rule of law. I find that very positive. In the case of Brazil, I would love to believe that some of the judicial and sort of the entire judicial system standing up to corruption. I know a lot of that, and some of it was mobilized and partisanized, but I think part of it has made it much more difficult for the Brazilian political game, which has always been about dando que se recebe, to make it a little bit more difficult, right? And so maybe the Brazilian system is becoming a little bit more resilient too. I don't know. I haven't studied the judicial branch as well as I should, given how it's elevated itself in recent years to being a really strong and seemingly autonomous branch of government. I'd be interested to hear other people's thoughts on that matter. I hope that's a decent response. Fred, I hadn't really thought about that question.
It is, thank you. Alrighty. Well, I think we've gotten through any of the questions that we had from the chat and that I had and Professor Danielle had. So I'll take this time to thank you once again, Dr. Nylen, for participating, as well as Professor Danielle, and of course, people that are working in the background, Professor Gioma, who we can't see right now, but has been working very hard to make sure this is all working very as smooth as possible. And the rest of the Letras professors that have been supporting. And anyone that's watching right now, has been a really, really wonderful morning, and we've had some great conversations. So thank you all so much for your participation. And if you haven't gotten the attendance list, it is in the chat. And I wonder if I can repost it, or should we repost it?
And while you're doing that, Fred, let me just thank everybody for their participation too. It's always lovely for me to talk about Brazil, and I thank everyone for putting up with the social scientist coming in and infecting the discussion with all kinds of unpleasant politics and economics. I appreciate your patience and all of that.
Okay.
And thank you, Fred, for mediating this talk. It was really, really enlightening. Thank you, Professor Nylen, for all your inputs. You'll give a lot of things for us to think about it. Thank you.
Soon. Thank you all for coming, and don't forget to come to our afternoon sessions, which start at 2 p.m. Sao Paulo time. Okay.